This video, I just want to address one very specific question, and that's the extent of the flood. Was it local or global? And that question is obviously important for how we respond to Bill Maher, but also how we talk to each other in the church. Here's my thesis. The biblical text can be responsibly read as describing a local flood, and therefore both a local flood interpretation as well as a global flood interpretation are orthodox. Whichever one is right and wrong, they're both legitimately Christian. In other words, this isn't an orthodoxy versus heresy issue. Now, I know that some of as much as my non-Christian viewers might be thinking that any kind of historical flood is just crazy to believe in, and I'll address that question at the end. A lot of my Christian viewers might be thinking, why would you even entertain the idea of a local flood? It's completely obvious that the Bible's describing a global flood, and I can kind of understand and sympathize with this immediate reaction. If you start reading through Genesis 6 to 8, you stumble upon references to all flesh, in which is the breath of life under heaven, everything that is on the earth, the face of all the earth, all the high mountains under the whole heaven, and lots of other little phrases and language like this that sounds, especially at face value in English translation, it sounds very universal. But if I could just make a plea for people to hear my case here, if you end up disagreeing, that's totally fine, and I'll consider your perspective. But I would just invite you to hear my arguments first before you make up whether you disagree with me or not, because this is surprisingly complicated. So the structure of this video is first 3 lightning quick clarifications just about what it means to talk about a local flood. Second, 2 arguments for why that's a responsible reading of the text. And then third, a defense of the flood story as a true account of a historical event. Before I dive in, I just want to do a real quick book recommendation since we're at the start of a new year and Okay, diving in, 3 quick clarifications about what is this proposal of a local flood. Number 1, local does not necessarily mean small. It just means it didn't cover the entire planet. So a lot of times people will say, well, if it was local, why do you even need an ark? Why do you just move out of the way, And a lot of people think that the flood was large and sudden and calamitous, but they simply think it doesn't concern Greenland and Japan and the South Pole and so forth. Second clarification, local does not necessarily mean that the flood didn't wipe out all human beings outside the ark. Some people think that, others don't. This is before the dispersion of humanity in Genesis 11 at the Tower of Babel. So the flood story is roughly Genesis 6 through 8. Chapter 9 is relevant. It's talking about Noah as well. So we're here in kind of that first section, the primeval history of Genesis. And this is before humanity had been spread out after the Tower of Babel. So lots to get into there, but I'm just pointing out you don't have to say a local flood means only one portion of humanity. So for an example of someone who believes in a local flood, but one that is still universal with respect to human civilization, check out the ministry Reasons to Believe, and Hugh Ross has done a lot of work on the flood story. That organization does a lot of great ministry, a lot of great evangelism, great apologetics, and he's a very good proponent of that view. So I'll put a link to some things that he's done on this topic, and I just encourage you to learn about that perspective. Third, local versus global is not a matter of the truth or historicity of the event. I just want to be really clear on this because sometimes people misunderstand this. I believe in a historical event that is truly being recorded in the Bible. It really happened. It's a trustworthy account we have in Genesis. That's not the issue here. The issue I'm addressing here is the extent of the water. Just that specific issue. Was it local or global? And basically, I just want to dive in and give 2 reasons why I think it may have been local. And even though I think the scientific evidence is overwhelmingly in favor of that and against a global flood, these aren't really scientific arguments. I'm going to make primarily biblical arguments, so they make a broader appeal. Because I'm not a scientist, and I'll just keep it focused on the scripture. I think from the scripture alone, you can make a pretty good case. So here's my 2 arguments. Number 1, the same language used in Genesis 6 through 8 that seems so universal is used for local regions all the time throughout the Bible. So the phrase, the whole earth, comes from the Hebrew word eretz, meaning land or country or earth or ground. Lots of different ways you can translate it. And then the word kol, meaning all or every. Eretz is used over 2,500 times in the Hebrew Bible. It's translated earth about 1/4 of the time. The phrase kol eretz, all the earth or all the land or all the country, is used about 207 times, and only in about 40 of those might it mean all of planet Earth. So in the majority of cases, by a pretty wide margin, kol eretz usually has a local referent. Now, sometimes you know that because of a qualifier. So, for example, in the first two occurrences of this phrase in the Bible, Genesis 2, 11, and 13, you have the whole land of Havilah and the whole land of Cush. But even without the qualifier, this is the common meaning. So years ago, Rich Deem wrote an article that listed 56 examples of kol eretz having a local referent in the Hebrew Bible. I'll put up on the screen the first 10 in canonical order, and then on this screen, and then I'll put the next 5 on the next screen. You can pause and read through these if you want. Already you can tell, like, you know, a translation like in the land gives you a very different kind of flavor of meaning than on the earth. But just to give maybe 2 examples to dive in, Genesis 41:57 says, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain because the famine was severe over all the earth. Now, we don't have to conclude that people from northern Siberia traveled down to the Middle East and the ancient Mayans beat Christopher Columbus to the punch in sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, and Aboriginal Australians made their way across India or the Indian Ocean to make it to the Middle East. I'm going to give lots of specific examples throughout this video. In no way am I trying to poke fun at an alternative view. I'm just trying to be specific with what this would mean. So when it says all the earth is afflicted by this famine and they come to Egypt, no one really interprets it meaning literally like all of planet Earth. And this is pretty recurrent all throughout the Hebrew Bible. 1 Kings 10:24, when the whole earth comes to Solomon to hear his wisdom, we're not required to think that people came from Canada and Brazil and East Asia and so forth to learn from Solomon. And that's true for the phrase kol eretz, all the earth, but also the other phrases in Genesis 6-8 that might seem universal initially, but then you see all throughout the Hebrew Bible, they're used for a local reference. Like the phrase under the whole heaven in Deuteronomy 2:25 doesn't mean that people like Native Americans in the United States at that time are afraid of Moses. When Elijah is told in 1 Kings 18 that there's no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you, we're not required to think of Ahab's spies going up into Scandinavia, various islands in the world where there's human civilization, and so forth. So basically what I'm trying to do so far is just appeal to context, in this case, the rest of the Hebrew Bible, to show this kind of language has a lot of precedent for having a local reference. Now, then we can just ask, why would that be? Why would they talk like this? And here we just have to try to submit ourselves to what the scripture is trying to communicate rather than immediately make us say, if I could just make an appeal for humility in how we read the Bible. We're reading an English translation with a modern understanding of planet Earth as a round globe orbiting the sun between Venus and Mars. So when we hear certain language, we're going to bring a lot to the table in terms of how we interpret that language. The biblical writers and the original readers were not aware of the South Pole or Alaska or New Zealand, so they would have absolutely no reason to use language that would reflect entities that they didn't know existed. They were just using the ordinary language of the time to refer to the known world. And that's completely natural for people back then to speak like that. When we say all the earth, we just mean all the earth we've ever known, And so our task in reading the scripture is to submit to what the original author meant and how the original hearers received the text. That is where meaning is furnished. And actually, so one way we respect the scripture is we submit to what it intends to say, rather than kind of immediately draw it into our horizon of concerns and all our modern questions, many of which the Bible actually isn't addressing directly. Even in the New Testament, you'll find comprehensive language to refer to the known world, the Mediterranean world. Colossians 1:6, the gospel bearing fruit in the whole world. Well, we know that, the American continents hadn't been evangelized yet. Acts 2:5 says there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven, and then the nations are listed, and it doesn't include places like Brazil and Japan and so forth. Now, one factor that supports this way of thinking in Genesis 6 through 8, that we're not thinking globally so much as the known world, is Genesis 10, which comes right after, and the so-called Table of Nations. This is listing all of the different nations that are descended from Noah and his sons, and they're all local. They're talking primarily about the Middle East, extending outward a bit into Asia and Africa and Europe, but we're not talking about Australia and Mexico and Northern Europe and so forth. And that provides more support for thinking that the sphere of awareness of the biblical authors was more limited. They were just using the ordinary language of the day to describe the world that they knew. Here's how Michael Heiser helpfully explains this point about Genesis 10.
What's the context of the nations in Genesis 1 through 11? What's the context of the world? And the answer is Genesis 10. The Table of Nations. We have 70 nations there. They're all Eastern Mediterranean, again, from the south, like in Africa, all the way up, to what we would call the Caucasus now. And so some people will argue that is the context for the flood. That is the landmass that was affected by the flood. That is a region. It is not an entire globe.